Hi. I hated my name growing up. I used to tell people they could call me Emma because it was just easier. I hated the name Iman because no one in my small, culturally isolated town could pronounce it. And when I say small and culturally isolated, I mean out of about 7,000 people, my mom was one of the only African Americans. When I was a kid, I never really identified as black, and no one else really saw me that way either because I'm light-skinned. That was also in part of the influence of my mom, who stuck out like a sore thumb and probably didn't want me to feel the same way. Maybe she tried to protect me when she would straighten my hair for every school picture, or when she would forbid me from using language that set me apart from the culture around me, or when she would try to make me wear clothes that matched just so I wouldn't stick out as much as I already did just being a weird kid. Of course, none of this ever occurred to me until I moved to Ann Arbor. When I first moved here, I was exposed to this whole new melting pot culture of people. And as I went to a much more diverse school, I became aware of my race for what it was, as well as what it signified to others. I could finally recognize the differences that seemed to define how people acted toward each other. But what came with it was the scary feeling of just how much I didn't really fit in. And if I didn't belong in a city like Ann Arbor, where did I? One of the biggest differences between my old town and Ann Arbor was the language used by people here. Words my parents exposed me to, but at the same time kept me sheltered from when I was told never to use them. Words like nigger. To be perfectly honest, the most times I've ever used the N-word was writing this speech. I don't use it in my everyday language, in part because my family doesn't. Another way my mom raised me white, as some of my friends perceive it. But when it comes down to personal choice, I don't use it because I believe it is a word that carries too much weight to be used casually. Reclaimed. That's a term you hear a lot. It's a right earned from a debt that can never be repaid. I don't disagree with that. To not reclaim the N-word is like forgetting about the long-held, widely accepted racism that heavily influenced this country. But I think teenagers in this era, having never lived in a time of American slavery or the early civil rights movement, are desensitized to the original meaning of nigger. Who does this word really belong to? Does it not belong to the people bound by it? The millions who were ripped out of their homes and packed like sardines in the bottoms of ships. The people who were denied the right to vote because their grandfathers couldn't. The people who lost their lives for no good reason other than someone else thought theirs was inferior. The people whose pain and suffering I can't even begin to imagine because I've never had to live a life of being owned. An outdated word that used to have the literal denotation of pain, it begs the question of whether this language should be used at all today. Does using the N-word colloquially not just remind us of this painful history? Does reclaiming it while excluding others not just manifest the conscious decision to self-segregate that keeps us separate? When using it in a negative connotation, we might really just be taking 2 steps backward when constantly reminded of the hate and resentment it ensues. It keeps us hesitating on either side from forging relationships with people outside our scope of identity. But on the other hand, is it even possible to move forward without acknowledging the past? Sadly, I'd have to say we can't just separate the past from today because the subtle tension between black and white, although quiet, is still very present. The fact is, although we live in a very progressive era, racial oppression is still binding in 2019. Optimists, and those who want to ignore the issue altogether, may argue we've gotten past the big barriers. But when black teenagers are getting shot in the street because the phones they were pulling out of their pockets must have been guns, I disagree. When everything our first African-American president says is overlooked until he produces a birth certificate, I disagree. When our leaders demonstrate on live TV how they applied their blackface, I disagree. To assume the oppression faced by many is just a thing of the past is simply naive. If we want to overcome these walls, it's important to remember what nigger used to mean. It's important to remember how we used to treat each other so it may change the small, conscious decisions that kept us unequal. It is also important to acknowledge how we treat each other today so we may change the unconscious decisions that we might not even notice in themselves construct invisible walls of hierarchy. Small decisions like who you sit with at lunch, who you choose to study with, anyone you treat differently based on appearance, maybe even subconsciously. The N-word is a reminder to do better, so we may strive to not make the same mistakes that made people feel like they will never fully be accepted, even if we didn't realize it. But in the grand scheme of things, nigger serves a greater purpose. Most importantly, it is proud. The kind of proud that hurts because you know how much pain and change came before you so that you could reclaim it. It is a sense of community, symbolic of a shared experience, and it is strength when the world tries to cut you down. Growing up in a small town of mostly people who weren't like me, I had never felt that before. By now, you're probably wondering why I'm speaking here today. Am I really black enough to give this speech? Am I too white to have an opinion on the matter? Unfortunately, I don't conveniently fit in a box that easily classifies me as one or the other. If you look at me, you might think I'm too light to really understand what it's like to exist in this world as an African American. But what you don't know is what it's like to be me. To be 16 and still not know your place. Listening to the teacher tell you, call out your name, and tell you she was expecting a different face. To have your friends tell you you are not all of what you are made of simply because they cannot see it from the outside. To feel not just like you don't get it, but that you're not allowed to get it from either point of view. To be told you're not black enough to be black, but you're not white enough to be white. To feel the constant stress of knowing as hard as you try, you're still standing on the outside of the glass looking in. Sometimes I'm so afraid to share anything about myself with a world that feels necessity to put a label on everything because I don't even know who I am. And that's really hard to figure out when there's this constant pressure to find a group and consistently identify with it. This is how we make friends, how we decide what we want to do with our lives, how we decide who we want to spend our lives with. But race shouldn't be the defining factor. Race isn't a label. Every time someone asks me, "What are you?" I just want them to understand that my race isn't what makes me me. But hey, I'm prejudiced too. It's really hard not to be. Society has made it an unconscious decision to use our predisposed ideals to categorize everything, even someone we just met. But I think we can all do better. And when I say we, I mean everyone. Not just the we that is one race or the other. We needs to come together to include everyone. Because right now, as a country, we aren't much of a we. And maybe not, this stems from the invisible walls we put up. When it comes down to it, no one should be pigeonholed by their race, especially not by a word. Nigger does not define anyone because no one is just one thing. By blood, I'm not. But I am not multiple things because I am mixed. I am more than just the words on the checkboxes because I'm an individual. And so are you, so is everyone. Everyone exists in this world in different ways. Everyone has different hardships, values, and goals. To assume we are all the same is the very stem of prejudice. But there's an even greater danger at hand when you try to categorize everything. Because when you define, you divide. And what we should really be working towards is learning to accept each other's differences and respect them without letting them separate us. To be honest, my race is a big part of who I am. It has shaped my upbringing and my views, but it no longer stands in the way of who I want to be and what I want to do. I'm not here to tell all of you what to say. People come on the stage to tell you what they believe in, their truth. But in reality, no one has all the answers. I know I don't. I'm just here working up the courage to speak my mind and start a conversation. But I hope we can all understand, whether you choose to use it or not, the N-word doesn't define you, and it shouldn't divide us as a whole. Where you will go, what you will accomplish, and who you want to be is up to you because you have the irreplicable power of being an individual. I've come to learn just how much more important that is than trying to fit in. So from now on, when someone asks me what I'm made of, I'll answer, I'm Iman. That is what I am. Nice to meet you. Thanks for listening.